If you guys have ever been to a public aquarium before, you'll have almost certainly seen this shark. It's a pretty impressive looking animal with their hunched back, large size, and gnarly teeth poking out the front of their mouths. These guys would have turned millions of heads in aquariums all around the world. They're also the only known shark species that actively comes to the surface to gulp air. It's not breathing that air, but instead is using it as a buoyancy aid to help it float almost motionless just above the sea floor. They're called sand tiger sharks. If you don't recognize the name, it's because they actually have a bunch of different names depending on where you come from. If you're from Australia, you'll likely call it a grey nurse shark, and if you come from South Africa, you'll call it a ragged tooth shark, or raggy for short. To save confusion in the science world, we refer to it as Carcharias taurus, and it's the most common shark species you'll find in public aquariums around the world. But there are lots of shark species that you won't find in aquariums. You're generally not going to find these guys in aquariums, nor are you going to find this one either, and you most definitely aren't going to find this shark in an aquarium, even though lots of people have tried and failed down the years. On the other hand, you'll occasionally find this shark in aquariums, and these guys, perhaps somewhat controversially, are found in a few aquariums scattered around the world. But what is it about a shark species that means it can survive and do well in an aquarium compared to other ones who end up dying in a matter of days? Well, today we're going to be having a look at a bunch of different shark species to try and figure out what makes them the ideal or not ideal candidate for living in captivity. And we're going to have a look at some other sharks, this one in particular, and find out why they can't survive in captivity for longer than a few months. Welcome back to another Shark Bytes episode, everyone. Public aquariums are found all around the world, and I imagine most of you at some point in your life would have been to one before. Some of them are undoubtedly better than others, but generally your higher quality aquarium will be an AZA accredited one. AZA is the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and they lay out a complete set of guidelines that zoos and aquariums use to ensure the safety and welfare of their animals. The AZA standards are performance-based, so if the zoo continually goes above and beyond the guidelines, it can maintain its AZA status, but if it dips below the standards that are set, it could lose it. Now, AZA isn't perfect, and there are still occasional loopholes where zoos and aquariums can get away with things that aren't exactly above board. For example, SeaWorld maintains its AZA status despite still keeping killer whales in some pretty dire circumstances, so you can see it's not perfect. But on the whole, an AZA accredited aquarium is usually better than one that isn't accredited. The rules and laws surrounding captive fish, including sharks and rays, are pretty sketchy across the world. It's a bit of a grey area in some countries, which means that some aquariums on occasion can pop a shark in a tank, even though that shark probably shouldn't be in there. The most common shark you'll see that we mentioned earlier is the sand tiger shark. And this shark, by all accounts, actually does okay in aquariums, which is likely why you'll see them often. Sand tiger sharks are quite a docile shark species and aren't really a threat to humans unless provoked or bothered. That doesn't mean they haven't been responsible for incidents with humans, by the way. Sand tigers actually rank quite highly on the ISAF list for unprovoked attacks on humans, coming in at 36 total attacks. This list doesn't include the provoked incidents as well, which again, I imagine is probably quite high. There was even an incident caught on film back in 2012 at an aquarium in South Africa where a veterinary diver tried to administer aid to a pregnant sand tiger shark and pissed it off just a bit too much. The diver took a nasty bite to the arm as the shark thrashed around for a few seconds before letting go. He did sustain serious wounds to that arm, but after a series of operations, he made a full recovery. More often than not though, these sharks are very chilled out in aquariums, and that's because they're a shark species that is somewhat suited to captivity, although they're not without their issues. In the wild, sand tiger sharks are commonly found just off the coasts, swimming around seamounts or even shipwrecks. They show high levels of seasonal site fidelity, which is their tendency to stay in a particular area during different times of the year, before then choosing to head off elsewhere to mate or to give birth. So it means that sand tiger sharks generally will spend a lot of their time swimming around these shipwrecks or seamounts, and they're quite content doing just that. I've scuba dived with these sharks on a number of occasions, mainly in Australia, but if you've dived with them before, you'll notice that they just calmly swim around almost in giant circles again and again. Kind of sounds similar to what they'd be doing in an aquarium, right? And that's exactly what they do. Although despite this shark being very common in aquariums around the world, they still occasionally have health issues while in captivity. Back in 2013, research was released that found a correlation between the size of the tank that the sand tigers are kept in and the prevalence of a spinal deformity within individuals. They found out at aquariums in the USA that the longer the tank, the less likely it would be that the sharks would develop these spinal deformities. So even for a shark species that at some points in time is considered highly residential in the wild, the size of the aquarium they were in still played a role in how healthy they were. And that's where our first and perhaps biggest classification comes in for sharks and aquariums. For most shark species in aquariums, the size of the tank plays an important role. Most sharks spend the majority of their life lives in the biggest tank of all, the ocean. Of course, there's no replicating the size of the ocean, but the bigger the tank, the greater the likelihood that a captive shark is going to survive and remain healthy. Some sharks, though, even when placed in massive tanks, don't seem to do very well in those captive scenarios. One of those is undoubtedly the great white shark. This enigmatic ocean predator has never been able to survive for very long in an aquarium setting. The last great white shark to be put in an aquarium was 2016 in Okinawa, Japan. The 3.5 meter male great white shark that was placed there was originally caught accidentally in a net off the southwest coast of Japan before it was transported to Okinawa. The shark, after appearing to initially be swimming around just fine, suddenly deteriorated and sank to the bottom of the tank, where it eventually died just 3 days after being put in there. The longest period of time any aquarium in the world has managed to successfully keep a great white shark alive for is 198 days, just over 6 months, and that was at the Monterey Bay Aquarium in America. The tank was specifically designed to house open ocean animals. It spanned 10 meters deep and had a total volume of 3.78 million liters of water, which is a lot, but it's pretty much a literal drop in comparison to the ocean. An Olympic-sized swimming pool generally holds about 2.5 million liters of water, so this Monterey Bay tank was about the size of 1.5 Olympic pools. The difference for this captive white shark, though, was that this individual was a juvenile, measuring about 1.2 meters long. Tiny. Despite being in a decent sized tank for its size, the white shark was still reported as having injuries due to swimming into the glass. And because of this, as well as the shark eating 2 of its tank mates, after those 198 days, the captive white shark was eventually released back into the wild. Monterey Bay housed 5 more white sharks at different points in time from 2004 to 2011, none of which got close to the 198 day mark. And because of this, their captive white shark program was closed down by the end of 2011. Their last shark in 2011 only stayed in the aquarium for 55 days and ended up dying after they released it back into the ocean. So these are small individual sharks that are being kept in a relatively large tank, and they still didn't manage to survive. One of the main reasons for that, though, is because great whites are considered to be these nomadic traveling sharks. These sharks swim big distances, even as youngsters, and even a tank that's the size of 1.5 Olympic swimming pools isn't large enough for them. It's just not big enough for a shark to continually swim forwards, which helps them breathe, and so they slow down, they bang into the glass, and then don't eat as much, and then eventually their health starts to fail. So from a behavioral and life histories perspective, sharks that travel these huge distances perhaps don't do very well in aquariums. But I know at this point some of you might be grumbling behind that screen saying, yeah, but Chris, what about whale sharks? Whale sharks are known to travel huge distances. Some of the longest migrations ever recorded have been from these big spotty fish. And there are quite a few whale sharks kept in captivity at aquariums in different parts of the world. Georgia Aquarium in the States is one that springs to mind, and the Okinawa Aquarium in Japan as well. I'm pretty sure there was also one in Dubai at some point too. But before I tell you about how whale sharks can survive in aquariums, make sure you hit that like button. Anyway, the whale sharks at Georgia Aquarium and at Okinawa have fared considerably better than white sharks in terms of how long they've survived in captivity. Georgia Aquarium had whale sharks that survived for 15 years or so, and Okinawa has had one whale shark in their aquarium for 26 years. So if these animals would normally be traveling massive distances out in the wild, how is it that they've been able to survive in these aquariums for way longer than great whites can? Well, it's not so much about space here, although that is a factor, but it's actually more to do with breathing. Remember earlier when we spoke about the great white shark struggling to breathe in aquariums because they haven't got enough space to pass that oxygen over their gills? Well, whale sharks can breathe in a slightly different way to great white sharks. Most of the time they'd be performing ram ventilation. So just like a white shark, they'd open their mouth slightly as they're swimming forwards and water would be passed across the gills. But every now and again, whale sharks can aspirate their own gills by buccal pumping, meaning they actively suck water into their mouths and pass it across their gills. So in a situation where they might find themselves in a tank, if they're struggling to get enough oxygen into their bodies, they can actively pump that oxygen across their gills. Great white sharks just can't do that. They're obligate ram ventilators, which means the only way they can get that oxygen is to be continuously swimming forwards. So this additional breathing technique for whale sharks might be enabling them to survive better in captive situations like aquariums. I suppose it could also simply come down to differences in the oxygen requirements between the two species. White sharks might just require more oxygen in their bodies because they swim faster than whale sharks. Just as a quick side note here, I'm not personally a fan of keeping whale sharks in aquariums. I know there's probably going to be some scientists out there who disagree with me on that one, but It just doesn't sit well with me. When you think these big fish can live to maybe over 100 years in the wild, but you've got the ones in Georgia dying after 15 years, that's a drastically reduced lifespan. So aquarium life really can't be that great for them, in my opinion. And when you've got augmented reality headsets capable of doing stuff like this, I'm pretty sure you could do a similar thing in an aquarium setting. Right, back on topic. So we've got the size of the aquariums that plays a role in survivability. We've got the actual behavior and life histories of the sharks, particularly in regards to breathing. What are any other factors that can make a difference? Well, traditionally, the shark species that you generally find in aquariums are your coastal, shallow water reef species or your benthic species, the ones that live on the seafloor. And this is because these habitats are easier to replicate in an aquarium setting. You can get some rocks, some corals, or you can line the bottom of the tank with sand or sediment. And that right there is another important factor. How well can the aquarium mimic the natural conditions for the shark species? In other words, how enriched is their environment? Epaulet sharks are a species you'll see quite a lot in aquariums, usually in their own separate tanks that are filled with rocks and corals and little nooks and crannies for the sharks to get into. These hardy little sharks are also often kept in saltwater home aquariums as well because they're relatively easy to look after. They've got the impressive capability of being able to survive in incredibly low oxygen conditions as well for extended periods of time. So there's not going to be those issues with not being able to breathe. But it's not just simply down to the actual physical environment being enriched. There are also other forms of enrichment that can be provided. Differing types of food or how food is presented to the sharks can stimulate and make their lives more enjoyable. Some aquariums like to feed their sharks using poles, others might occasionally freeze the food in ice just to give them a new experience. In this one here, you can see some sharks and rays who've been given some colourful eggs containing fish and squid, and the animals have to figure out a way into the egg to get the food reward. There's even aquariums who send divers in to try and replicate things that would be happening in their natural environment. In this video here, a diver begins to pour and move sand around just how a cleaner fish might be doing on a coral reef. The shark even moves over towards the sand and opens its mouth in preparation to have its fish spa treatment. So you can see there are lots of different ways that these aquariums try to mimic the shark's natural environment, and some of them go above and beyond with it. But they're not just doing it for the fun of it, they're doing it because this type of enrichment actually keeps the sharks stimulated and engaged, and this is going to help their overall health and well-being. Keeping sharks in aquariums can be a pretty divisive topic. You'll often get your no way, they should never be in there people, and then you'll get your absolutely yes people as well. But you can see it's not as black and white as that. There are some sharks where it will work and others where it won't work. And it all depends on a bunch of different factors, both from the shark species itself and the aquarium that's housing it. I've always felt that as long as aquariums adhere to the AZA standards and they try to go above and beyond for their animals, that they have an important role to play in public outreach and education. One particular aquarium though that definitely doesn't adhere to the AZA standards is an aquarium in Hendersonville, North Carolina. This little aquarium has gone through the ringer in the last few months, centering around their miracle stingray, Charlotte. And if you want to hear about this wild story, you should definitely click this video right here. In it, we tried to figure out whether the story of Charlotte the Stingray was just one big hoax. I promise you though, this story is a real roller coaster, so make sure you check it out here.